One of the paradoxes of a steward is that they seek to achieve the unattainable because what they have is something that's bigger than themselves. But that counterintuitively leads to a level of peace because they have a direction as opposed to a destination.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Sparks of Gratitude podcast. I'm your host, Randy Sparks, and we believe that you can change your mind and change your life. And it begins with the Sparks of Gratitude. And today we have an amazing guest, a close friend of mine named David York. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. This is great.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here. So David, I've known for, I don't know, maybe back since the first time I met you, I think was in about 2007, maybe.
Yeah, that
And you
sounds right.
were kind enough to take me to lunch a few times before I ended up working with you, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
But it's been a long time since then. And David, most importantly, is an amazing husband and father and friend, and he's funny as anyone you could ever imagine. And to me, I think the sharpness of somebody's wit is the greatest indicator of their intelligence.
Well, that's what I like to say, but
Yeah.
especially when I'm joking around. Yeah. Yeah.
David's also a CPA. He's been an estate planning attorney, public speaker, and he's written some amazing books, Entrusted, Riveted, and most recently, the one that I think we're going to spend more time talking about today is his newest book called The Gift of Lift, which is really, really good, David. It's about harnessing the power of stewardship and how we can live a life of meaning and purpose beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to talk about it because I've read it more than once and I really want to share this with other people.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was really a passion project. Took me 6 years, really, probably 4+ years of just thinking about it, and then about a year and a half just to write it and put it together. So it's been something I've been thinking about for a long time, but it was definitely, one of those things where you want to learn and you want to figure it out for yourself. And so it's kind of the culmination of years of thinking about the concept of stewardship.
Well, that's interesting. I have a question about that because my mind tends to work that way where I'll maybe latch onto a concept and I just let it marinate in my mind for a long period of time as it kind of things kind of add to it and I kind of start to connect it over time.
Sure.
Is that how it was for you, or were you kind of constantly adding to your notes like, okay, let's productive work along the way, or just
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely one of those things that was, it was a program running, sometimes in the background,
hmm,
sometimes in the forefront. But, someone told me once, you think you know something until you start to verbalize it. And then you think you have it down when you verbalize it until you try to write it down. And so I find the process of verbalizing concepts and ideas and then writing them down is really what hones something. And I know I'll think I have an opinion on something. I start to go share it. I'm just this inarticulate mess, or I think I can share it well, but then writing it down. So I think it's a really important process to go through. If you really think you believe something, write it down. And that process in and of itself helps add to the overall thoughts and beliefs. And so I think it's a great process. And so it's great to be thinking about stuff, but eventually, that process of verbalization and then putting it into writing really can help you crystallize thoughts and ideas.
yeah, I think that is an important way to think about it. I struggle with that sometimes where I remember reading a book once about astrophysics and I thought, wow, this is great. And I went to tell my wife about it thinking that I understood
Yeah.
it and I couldn't get 3 words out.
Yeah.
I said, I don't understand any of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's iterative too, but it's kind of funny, and the whole idea of stewardship as it started to gel within me, I don't know if everybody's old enough to remember this, but when I was a kid, I played slug bug,
Mm.
where it's just an opportunity to hit your siblings, but when you started looking for VW bugs, you started to see them everywhere, right? And until then, you're like, I had no idea there were this many out there. As I started to understand the notion and concept of stewardship and what a steward was, I started to see them more and more places. I saw them in history, I saw them in our communities, I saw them among my friends. And so once you get the idea and the concept, you start to see it more and more. So that actually helped build some momentum as I thought about it. Because then I thought, okay, well, what makes them unique, and how do they express their concepts of stewardship? And what's interesting is, even though there's all different kinds of people who are stewards, there's some through lines that you see in all their lives.
Well, I think that's a maybe a good place to start. Where you begin the book, you're talking about a realization you had that you didn't expect. Maybe you
Yeah.
can tell about that because the story is compelling.
Yeah, and she allows me to share this. But I was working at the time with Gail Miller, and still blessed and fortunate to do. She's one of the most amazing people that I have ever met, not just in the state of Utah, but in my life. And we were working on a trust to ensure that the Utah Jazz, which is, if you've been to Utah or you're from Utah, it is one of the most important things to the state of Utah. And we're really a one horse town. And she really wanted to make sure that the team stayed here long term. So we're working on a trust to effectuate that. And so she's reading through the trust, and I'm sitting with her, and I asked, I said, how will it feel to no longer own the Jazz? And she just kind of casually looked up at me and she said, well, I don't own the Jazz. Now, you have to realize she is one of the smartest, sharpest people in the world. Run At the time, they had 70 plus different businesses that they were operating, and she knew the details of all of them. But I'm still the estate planning lawyer, and so I kind of paused and I said, "Well, you actually do own the Jazz." And I'll never forget. She stopped what she was doing. She looked up at me. She said, "No, I'm a steward of the Jazz." And honestly, it was one of the most profound, certainly professional experiences, if not personal experiences in my life, because I saw someone who had transcended ownership, and it just made me wonder, what is this mindset? What is this mentality of being a steward? What does that even mean? We use that term in a lot of different contexts, but I don't know if we really knew what it meant. I don't think I certainly knew what it meant at the time. And so that's what started me on this journey of what is a steward and what does that even mean? And so as I looked at her life and her perspective, as I looked at the lives of other people that I saw those same characteristics, the definition that I came up with is that a steward is someone who's fully invested in something bigger than themselves. So they have these twin elements of deep investment, but transcendence as well. So they're all in, but it's not about themselves. And it's a very, very unique mindset, but it's incredibly powerful. And honestly, it's certainly beneficial to those around stewards. But ultimately, I think that the happiest, most content, most impactful people are stewards.
Well, Gail inspired this in you to think about it much more purposefully, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And then you started seeing slug bugs
Yeah.
and noticing stewardship around you. I mean, where were some other examples of stewardship that you have experienced, big or small?
Yeah, I started in the book talking about a man named Cincinnatus, who was a Roman citizen and who, in a time of turmoil, actually stepped in, became the emperor of Rome to deal with crisis, and then dealt with that crisis and stepped down, turned over his power. And he actually did that twice in life. He was actually a large influence in the life of George Washington, who did the same thing. People who took positions of power for something that was bigger or greater than themselves and then stepped back down. Unfortunately, as we look in the world today and we look, whether it's politically, socially, economically, you see people who have power and seek to retain it and to use it for their own benefit. But you see this in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. You see this in the lives of Nelson Mandela and others. I see this in the lives of stay-at-home parents who raise and care for their children, whether they're healthy children or disabled children, or care for parents. I see teachers who act as stewards, all people who pour themselves in, but it's not about them. And it's a unique mindset.
It really is, and you gave a lot of examples of all those that you mentioned in the book. I loved reading about those, and many of the stories I knew. I didn't know about Cincinnatus. I did know about George Washington, and when I read that in the book, I thought this sounds a lot like what George Washington did.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of those founding fathers, they had classical educations, and so they knew history. And that is one of the interesting things about stewards is that you have this high level of engagement. No one would argue that Washington wasn't all in. He was away from his home for over 7 years during the Revolutionary War. Didn't set foot at home one time. He was all in. And yet, at the height of his power, at the height of his success, when he could have basically stepped into any position of power, he stepped down. And then, when called into service again as president, served 2 terms and stepped down again. And it is counter what we too often live in, which is a construct of power. Those who have it, those who don't. Whether that's, again, political power, wealth, whatever that is, it's to see someone who uses it for the benefit of others is remarkable, but it's the best way to live.
It is pretty inspiring. You do a really good job in the book describing, or at least making a way to define this in a model, in a formula, an equation of what is transcendence, and then to say, how can we figure this out? What's included in transcendence or in stewardship?
Yeah.
And how can we become stewards?
Yeah, and I think one way to understand stewardship is to look at examples where there isn't stewardship. So if you think about these two variables, someone who is fully invested in something bigger than themselves, what do you have when you have someone who's not invested and there's nothing bigger than themselves? And that's where you find consumers. To me, the opposite of stewardship is consumerism, or the opposite of consumerism is stewardship, right? But unfortunately, too often we live in a consumptive world. There's nothing bigger than myself, and there's no level of personal investment or engagement. And it leads to a consumption mentality. And you and I see that every day in estate planning. And it's unfortunate. The average American inheritance is consumed in 18 months. So, what people work and accumulate over the course of their lives is on average spent by the next generation in 18 months. Even among the highest net worth, the average half life of inherited wealth among the wealthiest Americans, the half life is 8 years. So take what you inherit, cut it in half every 8 years. That's the average. And it's because we say, look, I'm going to give you something that costs you nothing and there's no meaning and purpose behind it. And it just invariably leads to consumerism. If you have someone who has transcendence, they see things that are bigger than themselves, but they lack the ability to invest or the willingness to invest, or they've never been asked. Those are what I call dreamers. Those are people we see those all the time. They're people who want to make a difference. They see the world as it should be, but they lack either the capacity or the willingness to invest and sacrifice for it. And then you have those who are fully invested. I call those owners. These are people who are all in. They're fully engaged, fully devoted. But ultimately, it's not about something bigger. And for them, the problem is they get to the end of the line. The business sells, the kids graduate and move on, and everything that they poured themselves into comes to an end, and then they lack that transcendent purpose or engagement.
Yeah, I've speak to that a little bit, because tell me if these are examples maybe of that owner. You talk about the consumer, which it seems like the world today and all the advertising and online, the world that we are part of is creating consumers out of us.
Yeah,
It's really incentivizing us having that type of a behavior.
yeah,
A dreamer wants to aim at something higher, but maybe not necessarily able to do so or not have the willingness to do so. Yet an owner, they take the initiative, they build something, they do something, they invest in something, and they've got skin in the game and they may be
mhm,
successful in it. I see kind of two contrasting examples to that. One might be, well, it's the parent who invests their whole life in their kids, and then the kids graduate and go to college, and now they say, well, who am I?
yeah,
Their whole entire identity was with their kids. Or contrast that with, you and I see this all the time, where somebody creates a business that's wonderful, successful, meaningful, lucrative, and then they may sell their business, and then they have, what are they, the post-sale blues,
hmm,
because their entire life and identity and time and sacrifice was all isolated in that one thing, which isn't necessarily negative in
yeah,
any way, but now that's gone.
yeah.
Right. So talk about how we go beyond that.
Yeah, I think you said you talked to Lee Brower on an earlier podcast, and
Yeah.
He's one of just such an example to me, and helped start me thinking differently. One of the things that he says, and I'm going to butcher what he says, so I may get an email from him, but he says the biggest threat to thriving is arriving.
Mm.
And one of the problems with ownership is that we set goals that can be achieved. And the problem is, what do we do once we achieve them, right? And that's why 70% of business owners regret selling their business within a year of the sale. And you think, oh my gosh, you built your business, it's worth all this money, you sold it, you've got it all, and you achieved everything. And what they realized was, yeah, I achieved everything, and it's done, it's finite. One of the paradoxes of a steward is that they seek to achieve the unattainable. And because what they have is something that's bigger than themselves, but that counterintuitively leads to a level of peace because they have a direction as opposed to a destination. Destinations can be arrived at, and then what? But directions are, it's the eastern sky, and there actually becomes a level of a peace that comes from that. Again, we talked earlier to mention Martin Luther King. What he sought to achieve was practically unattainable, at least within his generation. But by taking on something bigger than himself, it gave him a direction to continue to go in, as opposed to something that can be achieved. And when you take into those elements of past, present, and future, it actually can lead to a lot of peace, that establishing goals that can be achieved often end up leaving you hollow and disconnected.
When I talked to Lee Brower about that concept, you can check out that podcast too. Lee's amazing. It made me think of, and I talk about it in that, certain things that I achieved. I think I may have mentioned, finishing a marathon or an Ironman or something that felt so wonderful at the time, but immediately after I felt depressed
Mm-hmm.
because it was done and gone.
Yeah.
I arrived,
Yeah.
but
Well, and that's one of the things, honestly, that was so powerful, and I couldn't articulate it at the time with Gail. But what I came to understand about owners, and I think in our society, and I am all, I think capitalism is the best form of economic model for the good of the best, the most people. That said, capitalist model requires ownership, right? And what I have found over my life is that everything we think we own ends up owning us back. And we think that we have ownership over our house, our business, our investments, our second home, our cars, our RVs. And we realize we end up serving all these things. We have to, the care and the maintenance and the expense and the time and all of these things. And you see this with businesses, where people think they own businesses and businesses own them. Stewards aren't owned by anything other than their purpose. And the freedom that I saw that she had, where she just held it so lightly. In fact, a couple of years after that, another steward came along, Ryan Smith, who had a steward mentality. And she saw someone who could steward the team to the next thing. So it was, her identity was not the Utah Jazz. Her identity was stewardship. Her expression of that was the Jazz. In fact, the reason they bought the Jazz to begin with was to be stewards for the community. And when you own something for something bigger than yourself, you aren't owned by it. And so those people who are only owned by a purpose can sell a business, can transition, because it's not who they are and they're not owned by it. But I think that's the trap of ownership, and that's the trap that too many people fall in.
yeah, you mention on that topic, Viktor Frankl,
Yeah.
talking about freedom versus responsibility. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that, in our society, again, a very American culture is the concept of freedom. Freedom is very important, but as Viktor Frankl said, it's only half the equation. And that freedom in the absence of responsibility leads to an arbitrariness. It actually leads to self-indulgence. It leads to, in the worst forms, it can lead to abuse and mistreatment. And that he saw these twin elements of rights and responsibilities. And where you see so many problems in life is when you see the the presence of rights in the absence of responsibilities, and that you need to balance both of those. And you also have problems when you have responsibilities in the absence of rights. And so when you have rights and no responsibilities, you have entitlement. When you have responsibilities in the absence of rights, you have enslavement. And so really it's a balance of those two that's so necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, and didn't you mention he even proposed having on the other side of the United States, we've got the Statue of Liberty on one side, and he wanted a statue of responsibleness.
Yeah, the Statue of Responsibility.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a sculptor in out of Springville who came up with a model. It's actually cool. You could Google it, but the Statue of Responsibility. It actually shows it's two hands, one reaching up from the ground up, and another reaching
Mhm.
from the up down, and the responsibility that we have towards each other, which is certainly a key element of stewards. Is that it's not about yourself.
Well, in responsibility, that makes me think you do talk a lot about, well, what is the mindset of a steward, and purpose and meaning and values and how we get into that mindset.
Yeah, and that was one of the things again as I started to find stewards and I said, okay, what do they have in common? How do they operate? There were a couple of things that stuck out to me. Number one, stewards know who they are, what they value, and what they believe. They have clarity of why, and why drives everything they do. And Roy Disney, you and I are Disney fans.
Hmm.
Roy Disney said it. It's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are. And so, number one, they know what they value. Two, they use, and I think this is the most powerful, they use what I call a because therefore mindset. So many of us engage in what I call an if then mindset. Okay, if I do this, then you'll do this. If I take out the trash, then you'll make dinner. I take out the trash, you didn't make dinner, you violated this contract that we have. If I work hard at the office, then I'll be rewarded, I'll be promoted, I'll get paid more. If I start this business, then I'll become wealthy. And we enter into all these contracts with other people or with things, and it's all about expectations. And
Mm.
either our
And
expectations are met or not met.
and who's setting that expectation? Maybe I know that expectation, but the person I'm engaging with has no clue.
Exactly, exactly. And we all enter into these contracts that the other person may not even know or even know what those terms are. But the problem with an if then mindset is it's expectation based, and at best I get what I expect, and at worst I don't, and I'm disappointed and frustrated and angry because there was some violation of this if then. If I do this, then I get this, and people don't get it, and then they're upset. Stewards don't think that way. They use a because, therefore model. Because I value this, therefore I will do this. And they're driven by their values and expressing those values. And because it is a values based and values driven model, it will always come to fruition because I value connection. Therefore, I'm going to act in ways that connect myself with my spouse, my children, my community, the people I engage in. You know what success level you'll have? 100%, because you value connection. Therefore, you do this, and it's the mindset. Instead of trying to push your way to something, you're actually being pulled towards something bigger than you. And so that because therefore mindset fundamentally changes your approach and changes the outcome. And I mentioned it earlier too. The other thing I would say is stewards are guided by both the present and the future. So they have one foot in today and one foot in tomorrow. So they see the world as it is and they see the world as it should be, and they work to connect those two together. Dreamers see the world as it should be, but not necessarily the world it is today and what they can do. Others, they see the world as it is today and it leaves them depressed and despondent, but they don't do anything to change tomorrow. And so it's that through line of present and future that is another really powerful way to live and act differently.
So you quote Roy Disney, who says it's easy to make decisions when you know what you believe in or what your values are.
Yeah.
How do people know what their values are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's one of the things I ask people is, give me the elevator speech of your business. Well, our business does this and we value this. Okay, give me the elevator speech of your life. It's amazing to me how many people don't know who they are and what they value and what they believe. And when we first wrote Book and Trusted years ago, we recognized the importance of understanding your why. And yet at the time, I didn't even know what I valued. I'm like, heck, I'm a lawyer. Maybe I don't even have values. And so we actually developed some tools to help clients understand that about themselves. I think there's ways that you can do it. One is look at your passions and your interests and what excites you, what motivates you, what brings a tear to your eye. One way that I actually find you can really understand your values is what gets you really upset. Because often the opposite expression of your values is something that you get really passionate about. I am so big on gratitude and I'm so big on generosity. And nothing angers me more than ingratitude and stinginess or lack of generosity. And so, that's one of the ways I learned that those were my values because those are, for other people, it might be injustice. They have a high level of justice and injustice. Just, I've seen a lot of people just get so angry. Or mercy. When there's a lack of mercy, you see people who get upset. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He so values empathy. And when he sees people being judged without understanding the circumstance or situation that that person's in, it just makes him really upset. So it sounds a little counterintuitive, but think through what makes you really mad and upset. And it can actually be a way to understand what you value.
Yeah, it turns the light bulb on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you've actually done so much work to help people discover what their values are and even created models and tools for that. I think that connects so well to the stewardship mindset of saying, I'm moving toward the unattainable. My values, my core beliefs are in something far beyond, and I'm going to fail along the way at that, but I value it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just to give you an example, I share this in the book, but it was a great example. I sat down with a family office once and we went through an exercise to understand what their values were. And they came up with three values. One is loyalty. They wanted to be loyal to each other and to those that they serve. Second is integrity. They wanted everything they do to be marked by integrity. And then the third is excellence. They wanted everything they did and touched to be excellent. Now, unfortunately, the acronym was LIE, but set that aside for just a second. So they came up with these that afternoon. They were looking at an investment that they had spent months looking at and debating the merits of it, and it penciled out really well. It could be very cash flow positive, but it was geographically remote. It was going to take a lot of time and effort, and they had a lot of other things going on, and so they were hemming and hawing on whether they should do this investment, this project. And so I asked them, I said, let me ask you this. Can you do this project with excellence? And they said, done. We're not doing the deal. Yes, we could make money on it, but ultimately we can't do it with the excellence that we want our brand to be known for. And if you knew this brand, you would know that excellence is that brand. And so they didn't do it. So what was months of hemming and hawing became a 3-second decision once they looked at it through their values lens. So I actually think you go through that process and get to that point, you'll end up, it makes things a lot simpler.
So when you were writing your book Entrusted, which really focuses on similar topics of values and family wealth transfer and stewardship
Yeah.
and discovery of those values, your successor book helps people discover values. How did you go through the process for yourself discovering your own values and
Yeah.
defining those?
Yeah. So maybe like you, I don't bike near as far as or near as fast, but I do like biking. And I was out on a bike ride once thinking about this and what this concept was. And so we actually developed a card game from that day. I was like, why couldn't you just create a card game that people could play? And because what I wanted it to do is to be not just diagnostic, but experiential. And I think understanding our values at our roots is an understanding of our identity and our experiences. Because I find all of our values come from one of two places. They're either just innate to who we are, they're fingerprints of God. They're just, as you were created to be determined, loyal, creative, or they're from life experience. They come to us from successes or often failures. We value integrity because we dealt with someone who lacked it. We value honesty because someone was dishonest with us. We value generosity because we were in a difficult time and someone was generous with us. And so I wanted people to not just understand their core values, but understand the origin story, understand the narrative wisdom that came from that, and to share that. We were talking before, I'm a firm believer that data and information inform, questions and stories transform. And as we've been in this information age, we think that all we need is the right information. Give me the right information and I'll make the right decision. How many times do we see in life people have all the information and they make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision? It's not about information, it's about transformation. And I think we need to stop trying to give people answers and start asking people questions. In the gift of lift, I think I've got over 50 questions for people to ask themselves, to ask their spouse, loved ones, business partners, others, because I really think it's about discovery, and that happens through questions and stories.
I've experienced that. I've gone through multiple iterations of the process of uncovering and defining my values. And I suppose I'd say it that way. It's like the Michelangelo example
Yeah,
of like, you know, the statue of David was already in this hunk of marble.
yeah,
He just needed to clear off the other stuff. I just needed to get stuff out of the way. Those values are in here.
yeah,
They're in my heart and my soul. It was just like you explained at the beginning of, you think you know and believe something, but then when you want to put it to words or paper,
yeah,
oh well, that takes some work,
yeah,
but it's in there.
yeah,
And so discovering and being able to define what you actually feel or believe, that takes a process.
yeah,
And I really appreciate the questions you put in here because it helps people think through that process. And my observation is it's not teaching, you're not telling anybody what their values are.
yeah,
They're discovering what their own
yeah.
values are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I One of my side hobbies that I love doing is planning trips. I love planning trips for myself and my family. I love planning trips for other people too. Like you say you want to go on a trip, I'm interested. And it's just how I've always been. And then, one day it dawned on me, my core values are experience, generosity, connection, gratitude. All of these things that I value so much are expressed in doing that. I love trying to help people come up with great experiences that they can connect with others, that they can enjoy and get a sense of that shared experience, that gratitude that comes from that. And that's one of my favorite things in the world to do, and I love seeing families understand the impact of wealth and creating a vision for their wealth and its purpose. I love that, but it's because it's just living the core values that I have. I was talking with a friend of mine whose adult daughter wants to do a bike trip with her dad, like 100 miler. And dad hasn't been biking for a little bit, but he's going to get a bike in and preparing. And she's all excited. She's like late 20s. And we took her through this assessment to figure out what her core values were. Her core values were determination, experience, loyalty. I mean, every single one of her core values was expressed in this desire to go on this bike ride with her dad and take on something that was bigger than the two of them, take it on together, take on the adventure of it. And I think that's when we're most alive. And I think, unfortunately, we think we value bank accounts or a car or a house or whatever it is. And it's not what keeps us. That's not what ultimately creates any level of satisfaction.
Yeah, those things back to your previous statements that they own us.
Yeah. Yeah, we think we own all these things. I tell you, I've seen people worth, 100, 200, $300 million who looked like slaves. And I've seen other people of no material wealth at all who are only owned by a purpose bigger than themselves, who are the freest people in the world and the most impactful. And so, if we're not careful, everything that we think that we use to create and bring life brings destruction.
Well, you talked about gratitude being one of your core values. I mean, and that's just right on brand, guys. This is the Sparks of Gratitude podcast.
Yeah.
So, talk to me about why gratitude is so important to you and what it means to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I gratitude is something that I think is again just innate to my life experience and personal experience. And there's so many people in my life that I've been grateful for, opportunities that I've been grateful for. And I'm just a firm believer it's the difference maker in life. The happiest, most impactful, most intentional people I've ever met are grateful. And gratitude is just, it's an open hand to the world. And so, again, I think you can get elements of gratitude in different ways. Again, we go through this experience where we help people identify their core values. Faith is one of those. And some of the people who I think would be the highest in faith, it's not even in their top five values. I remember asking somebody once, like, I said, "Why isn't faith in one of your top five values?" And they said, "Because my faith is expressed through determination, generosity, empathy, excellence, productivity. That's how I express faith." And
Mm.
so, I think gratitude is such an important value, but it can often be expressed through the expression of other values, right? I think generosity is a form of gratitude. I think connection and empathy are expressions of gratitude as well. But so I do think, again, it's the other funny thing is our values, your core values are the best core values. If they weren't, you would have other core values, right? My core values, which are different, are the best core values. And so if we're not careful, when we don't see core values in other people, we think that they lack something. And yet the reality is there's so many different ways to triangulate in. Stewards come from all different backgrounds, all different kind of core values. But personally, I do believe that gratitude is kind of the wellspring of all the others. But, for others, how they live their wellsprings of values actually leads to gratitude too. So,
Yeah, well, you're preaching to the choir, David. I don't believe that somebody can be a real steward without gratitude.
yeah,
I think that that's fundamentally that is a foundational principle and value that the others stand on.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and I think, again, I think going back to this whole concept of ownership and everything else, I think so much of the world today seeks freedom, and stewards seek freedom from them. And they realize that freedom, when it's all about yourself, is actually a form of slavery. It's self slavery. And it's slavery to your demands, it's slavery to your expectations, it's slavery to your needs and your wants and all of those things. And you're not any freer. $200 million won't make you free if you're a slave to yourself. But if you're free from yourself, then it becomes irrelevant. That's where I think gratitude is a great way to avoid that self slavery that can happen when we focus on freedom for ourselves.
well, that's a beautiful way to button this up, David. I appreciate your time. Now,
Yeah,
I think everybody check out David's book, The Gift of Lift. You can find it on Amazon. And in fact, I'm going to give away, a dozen or maybe even more copies of this to anybody that wants one. And I'm going to ask this guy, David York, to sign them. I
I
mean,
would gratefully do that.
yeah.
Yeah,
And just go to sparksofgratitude.com/gift of lift. And maybe we'll give away one a day
yeah,
and get in there. And we'll do that for you. And you can also find David. David's been a public speaker. He's got an amazing TED Talk. You can look on YouTube. I'll put the links to this in there. I appreciate you so much.
yeah,
I
anytime.
I feel like some of the values that you have, I value much. My core values are connection, gratitude, and experiences,
Yeah,
and they really all tie together because I believe that connection, deep relationships are formed through shared experience,
yeah.
and it's all in that gratitude. It just feeds itself, and that's what's most important to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I just real quick on that point. I had someone who said to me once. He said, "We think we have shared connection because we have shared values. We create connection through shared experience." And I think that's so true. And I think when we experience life together, it breaks down a lot of the differences and creates so many similarities and points of connection.
Well, I love it, David. Thanks for sharing with
Anytime.
us today, and maybe we'll have you. Maybe we'll have our next conversation on the bike. Let's go share an
Yeah, let's
experience
do that.
together.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll see you next time, everybody. And remember, if you like this, the more people that like this, leave us a comment, then I can get more amazing guests like David. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.